Hello, I'm John Paul and I'm here at Rover with us today to do a head gasket on a Rover 75 1.8 turbo. Whilst it's the head gasket on the Rover 75 we're going to do today, this engine is also fitted in the Freelander 1, the Rover 25, the Rover 45 and also the MG, the ZR, ZT and ZS. So this is basically the same engine. In the same job we're also going to show you how to do the Cambelt and also the water pump. First job we're going to do is disconnect the battery. So there's two little lugs on the side. Lift the cover up, put it to one side, get your 13mm spanner, slacken off the nut on the negative terminal and then just lift the terminal off. Just before you do that, if your car has got a radio with a code in it, make sure you got the code before you disconnect the battery. Otherwise you can use one of the radio safety devices that just keeps the little bit of power in the system. I'm going to drain the water first, so I've already released the cap off the header tank. I'm just going to release this lower under tray. There's a series of screws along the front, a couple of nuts and bolts each side, and then just two clips in the middle. So once you've released all those, just take the under tray down. And we can just get to the hoses a little bit better. But unfortunately, there is no proper drain plug on these radiators, so we are going to have to drop a hose. So just make sure you've got something to catch the water in appropriately. These are the little spring clips that hold the hoses on these sort of vehicles. You can get a proper wire clippy thing that you can actually undo these properly with, but you can also do it with, if you haven't got one of those, just get a pair of pliers, clamp it together, just move it out of the way and release it. And then it's just a case of prising the hose away from the adapter there, and we'll just get our bucket right underneath, and then I'm just going to drop the water straight into the bucket, which is a little bit of a messy job if you're not careful. So I'm just going to move that into place, take the hose off, and just try and gently let the water flood out into the bucket. Because it is a turbo version and we need to release the manifold from the turbo to the head, we just need to make the turbo so it can move a little bit so we can release it from the studs. So we are going to have to take the front pipe off, so 3 bolts around the flange, 2 bolts on the clamp and 3 bolts on the flange to the turbo, and then we'll have to retake the oil return pipe and feed pipes off the turbo as well because they're both hard, and then we'll be able to get a bit of flexibility with the turbo to take the top of the manifold off. So first thing I'm going to do is release these rear bolts where it bolts to the front pipe. I've taken the front pipe off, and I've also taken off the 4 13mm nuts off the turbo where the turbo bolts to the bottom of the manifold. There's 3 up the top and 1 at the bottom you can get to. Now I'm just going to remove the heat shield from the front of the manifold and also the alternator bracket. We'll get them out of the way, then I'll just move the alternator slightly forward, and then I'll be able to get to all the 15mm nuts that hold the exhaust manifold onto the cylinder head. Just one thing I forgot to mention earlier was when I to release the alternator bracket, I just had to take off the alternator belt. So it's just a 13mm spanner. Just down the front of the engine you'll see the spring-loaded automatic tensioner. Your 13mm spanner, you just pull it towards the front of the car, that releases the pressure on the belt. You can just flip it off the top of the alternator, and then you can prise the alternator forward, and then you can get the alternator brackets off the engine. And then I've taken the 5 15mm nuts off the exhaust manifold. We've already dropped down the turbo earlier, and now you might need a bar just to wiggle the exhaust manifold off the studs, and then this is the exhaust manifold off. Once it's off the studs, you just have to wiggle it around the coolant hoses down there, and then once it's off we can move on to the next job. As you can see down here, with the exhaust manifold missing now, the inlet into the turbo from the exhaust is there blatantly obvious in front of us, so it's probably worth just putting a little bit of rag into the hole, so if we do drop any nuts and bolts later, they don't go in the turbo. Now we've got the exhaust side of things all taken off out of the way, we're just going to take a few induction bits off. So we'll take the airbox top off, just release this little vacuum control valve, take off the induction pipe there and the induction pipe to the inlet manifold. So not too much of a job, little clip to release the vacuum control, 2 screws at the top, and then the whole box will flip forward. So let's take this pipe off here first, a little bit of a prise, then we'll take these 2 screws out, and then whole box just flips forward just to release the two little clips at the bottom. Just going to take the top hose off now, and there's also another hose that's the joins at the back, and also a little temp sender unit. They've not got a conventional sort of Jubilee clips on these, they've got little spring clips, so you have to take this little spring clip off, which is like that, and I'll show you a bit better in a moment when we've got this pipe off how it works. And then it's just a case of prising the hose off. So you can see the little, if you can see the little cone shape with a lip on the metal bit, and then obviously the plastic bit fits onto that, and the locking device is the little metal clip that we've just taken off. You could leave the inlet manifold bolted to the head to take the whole thing off together, but I am going to take the inlet manifold off because we want to change the gasket from the manifold to the head. So it's fairly self-explanatory really. There's a couple of breather pipes at the top. There's got your electrical connections, your throttle cable, a cooling breather pipe down there, and also the vacuum pipe to your servo. The servo pipe, where it connects to the manifold, has got a push fit connector in it. So to release it, you push the pipe in slightly, hold the little red sleeve in, and then you pull the pipe out. So that's nice and simple, but you don't just want to be pulling it out because you will break the connector. The rest of it's fairly okay. Say the breather pipes, the electrical connectors, then there's the 13mm spanner size nuts onto the studs that bolt the manifold to the head, and then you'll be able to release the manifold. Here's the inlet manifold off now, and you can see the rubber gasket is like an O-ring type gasket that fits into the plastic manifold, and they do go brittle, they snap little bits off, and this is sometimes when you have running problems where they're running too lean. It's this gasket that's the problem. It just goes so it sinks into the manifold too much. It doesn't make a proper seal to the head, and then it gives a bit of a leak of vacuum, and that's what causes some of your running problems. So it's always definitely good idea to change this gasket. I'm going to remove the black plastic cover now. This will reveal the coil packs on top of the spark plugs, which we'll need to remove. So it's an 8mm socket, just 3 bolts. Once that's off, here you can see the coils, the leads, and onto the plugs. We'll need to remove all that, disconnect it so we can get down to the plugs, remove them, and then we'll take off the rocker cover. There are slightly strange arrangements on these. You've got one coil that goes on top of the plug, and then you've got another lead that comes off that particular coil, and you need to, there's 2 8mm spanner size bolts hold each coil on, which you would just need to undo and lift the coils up so you can release the wire on the end of each coil, or certainly the front coil, and then you can pull out the coils, pull out the leads, and put them to one side. That's the coil packs all out of the way, and the leads and the wiring out of the way. So now I'm going to remove the cam cover. There's just 8mm spanner size bolts. There's 3, 6, 9, 12, 15 of them. Take them off, and then the cam cover will just lift up, and then you'll be able to see the cams. That's the cam cover removed, so now you can see the cams. There's one other thing. There's an earth lead just on the back of the engine here. Just need to remove that. It's 13mm spanner. Well, it is on this one. To be fair, it doesn't look like the proper bolt for the job, but it is on this. So then that's done. So everything on the top end now is done by the Cambelt. So we'll now go underneath, support the engine, remove the engine mount, and then we'll time up the engine. I've jacked the vehicle up. I've taken the right hand front wheel off because we're going to now take the cam belt off. So we're going to time the engine up and take the cam belt off. So the first thing to do is to remove this inner plastic wheel arch cover. There's a couple of sorts of clips there. There's the ones where you prise the centre out, and then you can remove the clip, and there's some that's got a screw down the centre. So you unscrew it and then prise the rubber off, and then it's just a case of there's 2 sensor wires up here. There's one for the ABS and one for the pad wear sensors. You can take them off on the inner wing, or you can, once you remove the plastic cover, you can just unclip them from the back of the cover, and you'll see there's just 2 plugs and you pull them apart. Here's the alternator belt that we took off earlier when we took the exhaust manifold off. Now the other belt that's on is for the power steering, and on it's a spring loaded adjuster that holds this belt, and here's the 13mm spanner size nut that you put onto the adjuster. Then you can release the tension on the belt so that you can then take that belt off, let the tensioner go, and then we can thread both belts out now, and then we will then time up the engine. Before we can turn the engine over to time up to find the timing marks on the timing belt, a few things we need to do. we need to support the engine because we're going to take off the engine mount on the right hand inner wing. Then we'll need to take off the plastic covers to expose the timing belt. That's what we're going to do now. So I'm going to support the engine underneath this on the ramp that we're on, but however you've jacked it up, you might need to use a jack, blocks of wood or whatever, but yeah, just make sure it's safe. And now I'm going to remove the engine mount on the right hand inner wing. So this top black bracket here, we'll remove that first. So get a 15mm spanner, take that bolt out there, then there's 2 more bolts here, either with a windy gun or spanners and socket, and then we'll take that black bracket off, and then we'll be able to get to the nut on the top of the engine mount and the 3 15mm spanner size bolts that go through the aluminium casting. We need to remove the 5 8mm spanner size bolts that hold the cover on for the cam belt. So they're all out, lifted out of the way. Here we can see the cam belt, cam wheels, tensioner, water pump, which will be changing shortly. So now we'll go back downstairs and I'll time it up and show you from there. Not too many special tools needed on this job. Pretty much all you need is a cam locking tool, which we'll show you how to use in shortly. I've put a 22mm socket on the crankshaft pulley and I've turned the engine over until these timing marks are in line on the camshaft pulleys. It says exhaust there, inlet there. So obviously exhaust side, inlet side. So when they're lined up, if you get this special tool, slide it in there, and then that just holds the cam wheels in line. Then we can release the tensioner, remove the cam belt, and then we'll need to remove this plastic cover. So we will have to remove the cam wheels as well. We're now going to remove the lower crankshaft pulley. The proper way to do this is to remove the starter motor, fit the locking tool into the flywheel, and then use a bar, or alternatively use a windy gun. Bottom pulley off. Now what we need to do is we'll just replace the bottom pulley bolt so we can make sure the timer is dead correct. You see your 2 little pins there, and there's a little pointer on the block, so they need to be in line, and obviously your top 2 camshaft pulleys need to be in line as well. I'm now going to remove the lower plastic cover on the cam belt. There's just 3 bolts, 8mm spanner, just crack them off, take all 3 out, and then we can remove the cover. Then we can see the whole of the cam belt. We'll check the timing again, and then we'll release the tensioner up top and take the cam belt off. We can now use a 10mm spanner, release the tensioner, get a 6mm Allen key in the adjuster, so you can unadjust it as far as it will go. And then it's just a case of feeding the cam belt off the gears, and then you can take it off. Now I'm going to take the 2 cam wheels off. So it's a 17mm socket. Your camshaft locking tool, which is, if you use the proper one, should be more than adequate for holding the cams while you undo the centre bolt. Do that, undo that centre bolt, undo the other one. Then once they're out, you just prise the pulleys off the end of the cams, and then we can take out the 8mm spanner size bolts and release the plastic cover. With the cam wheels out of the way, I've taken out the bolts that hold the cover. There's just 1 bolt that tucks right down the back that comes from the back. Don't forget that one. And then you can just pull the cover forward. A little bit awkward to just get around the engine mount, but you just have to feed it round, take it out, and then we can get on with taking the head off. We're now on the last part before we take the head off. We're now going to undo the 10 head bolts. Use an E12 female Torx socket. And then start from the outside in, so we'll go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It's just worth mentioning at this point there are 2 head bolts here that don't come out without turning the cams, because they've got the lobe on them that the cam sensor picks up on. So to get those 2 head bolts out, you will have to turn the cams. There is a spanner section in the middle. You can put a spanner on it to turn the cams to get the lobe out of the way, but make sure that you put the lobes back in the correct place. It might be just worth you just marking the front of the cams with a little bit of Tipp-Ex so you know exactly where you were. And we've got all the head bolts out now, so it's just a case of lifting the head off. The head does sit on a couple of dowels which it might get a little bit tight on, so you might still have to get an eel bar just to prise it a little bit at the front and the back, just to raise it off those dowels a little bit, but don't be too aggressive. It shouldn't take much getting off. And then it's a case of just lifting the head off. We'll put it onto the bench now, and then we'll have a look at the head, and we'll also have a look at the head gasket. I've got the head on the bench now, and I've cleaned up all the surfaces where the inlet manifold goes to, where the exhaust manifold goes to, and obviously the head gasket surface itself. Just check around all the water jackets, make sure there's no corrosion. You need to really check if this vehicle has been overheated. It's probably best, to be honest, to send it away and get the head skimmed, because they do warp. But if you just want to check it, get a straight edge, put it along the long edge, and then get a feeler gauge and just put the feeler gauge underneath the straight edge just to see if there's any distortion in the head. If there is, obviously you have to send it away and get it skimmed. I've cleaned out the gasket, the rubber gasket out the inlet manifold. Make sure you really do scrape it out to get it all out, so when you put the new one in, it'll sit nice and proud, so we can, when we bolt it up, we don't get any air leaks. Also cleaned up the top of the cylinder block where the head gasket is going to sit, and I've also clean around the cylinder liners. Now just be careful with the cylinder liners. You don't want to move them at all, because they do have a seal at the bottom, and if that does leak, obviously the water will go into the sump, and then you've got another problem to contend with. So that's them all cleaned up, ready to go. The next job we're going to do is, while we're here, we're going to change the water pump. Nice and easy when when the head's off, so we'll show that now. I've removed the 4 8mm spanner size bolts that hold the water pump to the block. Now there is one 10mm one at the bottom, and this is it, and as you see, it's got the clip there that the timing belt cover goes onto. So once you've got the last bolt out, just be aware there is still water in the block, so you will need to put something to catch the water. When you knock the water pump off, some water will come out. So just give it a quick tap, and then remove the water pump. Now we can clean the surfaces up and fit the new one. I've fitted the water pump now, bolted it all back up. Now before we can refit the head, in this kit, when you fit in this uprated multi-layered head gasket, you need to fit a new oil feed rail, and that is, unfortunately, you've got to take the sump off to refit this. Now we're ready to take off the sump. So number one, I'm going to drain the oil. Once that's out of the way, just should mention as well, is that we jacked the engine up underneath when we took off the top engine mount. So obviously that's going to have to be moved now, because we need to take the sump off. So you can either support the engine from the top using a rail across between the wings and a chain. We've used a transmission jack just to take all the weight, so we can then take off the sump. Remove the lower engine mount, remove the bolts from around the sump, and then there's 2 bolts that just come in from the back of the bell housing into the sump. Once they're all out of the way, give it a tap, we'll drop it down, and then hopefully we'll be able to see the uprated oil rail. Now that's all the bolts out of the sump, so we can drop the sump down, and here we can see the rail, the oil rail that we're going to be swapping. So it's going to be a case of take off the oil pickup pipe, take the rail off, and refit the new one. So we'll show that now. The oil pickup pipe is a plastic pipe, and it's just held onto the rail with 2 8mm spanner size bolts. And once they're both out, just give it a bit of a twist and take that out of the way. We'll probably be changing that O-ring in a second, and then you can remove the last 2 8mm spanner size bolts out of the oil rail, and then we'll remove that. I'm just going to fit the new oil rail now. You will see that the actual oil rail itself is almost like a tube that runs through the centre there, and that needs to go to the front, because obviously the oil holes are there at the front that needs to go into. Now this rail just bolts straight up. This is also, because you've got such long head bolts, this is also where the head bolts actually screw into. So the head bolts go through the whole engine into this plate at the bottom here. So it's just a case of fitting it back, put your 2 bolts, one at the front, one at the rear, and then we can refit the oil pickup pipe. I'm just going to refit the oil pickup pipe now. One thing to mention, I said we're going to put a new O-ring in, which we have. It doesn't come in the kit. You will need to get that separately, as for the sump gasket as well. If it's damaged in any way, you will need to buy a new sump gasket. I mean, it is a metal gasket anyway, so it probably will be okay if you put a bit of gasket goo on it. But yeah, you will definitely need to just bear that in mind. So let's plonk that back in place. Put the 2 bolts, locate it back in, tighten them up, and then I'm going to pop the sump back on. Right, that's the sump cleaned. Clean the surface where the sump goes onto the block, and then pop it back into place. Get a couple of bolts started, then make sure you start all the bolts before you tighten any of them up, so you know that they're all in the right position. And that's it, we'll move back upstairs. Just while we're at this stage now, I'm just going to fit the inlet manifold gasket just while the head's off. It's just easy to get to. It's a rubber gasket, It only fits on one way. There, we start at one end and you just feed the gasket all the way in. Make sure it goes in all the little grooves nicely. Around the water jacket at the end. 2 little lugs, one each end, and that's how you know you've definitely got it right. Just make sure that's all in properly. That's it. Now we can put the head gasket on. Here's a new multi-layer gasket. As you can see, obviously it is a multi-layer. There's a little arrow and an F there, so that means for the front of the engine. So make sure you sit it down onto the dowels. The front is obviously to the front, and then put the top layer on, and then we're ready to put the head on. Right, now I'm ready to put the head back on. Just sit it down as well as you can. Obviously it needs to sit on the front and rear dowels, so just be careful and just sit it onto those dowels, and we can put the head bolts in. So that's the head back in place. I've replaced all the head bolts now, and I've just tightened them down. I haven't tightened anything down, I've just nipped them down so they're all ready to be torqued down. And we need to go 25 newton meters, and then 180 degrees, and then another 180 degrees. So the tightening sequence is fairly simple on these. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I'm sure if you've got an owner's manual, the diagram for the head tightening sequence will be in that as well. But that's what we're going to do now. So first 20 newton meters, and then you go all the way around. Just nip them all up first. You can do it again once they've all nipped. That multi-layer gasket does take a bit of clamping down really, so this first 20 newton meters can sometimes take a little bit of time just to get it right. And just keep going around. Here we're starting to click now, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Now we need to do the 180 degrees. A couple of ways of doing this. If you've got a dial gauge or a torque wrench with a dial gauge, then use that obviously. If you haven't, you can always, if you mark each head bolt with a bit of Tipp-Ex against the block, you'll be able to judge your 180 degrees by then. And it's the same sequence again. It's 180 degrees, and then you do 180 degrees again. So it's a full 360 by the time you're finished. I've turned the cams back to roughly where they need to be, back onto our Tipp-Ex marks that we did at the front. They just need to be rough because we will time it up properly when we're going to put the Cambelt back on. I'm now going to replace the inlet manifold. We put the gasket on earlier, the rubber gasket, and now it's just a case really of just lifting it into place, replacing our nuts and pipes, the bolt for the dipstick tube, and then we're going to move on to the inlet manifold. So that's the inlet manifold back on, all the nuts are tightened up, the bolt for the dipstick tube is back in. I'm just going to replace the vacuum pipe for the servo. It's just a push fit, so just push it straight in. That's nice and solid. Now I'm going to fit the exhaust manifold. We've cleaned up the surfaces on the exhaust manifold where it goes to the turbo and goes to the head. I'm going to put the new gasket in between onto the head there, and then I'm going to refit the exhaust manifold. Don't forget to take out our little bit of rag that we put in the turbo to stop any nuts and bolts going in, and then that's it. Put it down, bolt it back up, and that's that done. So that's the exhaust manifold all bolted on nice and tight, and obviously the turbo on this particular model, the turbo is bolted back onto the manifold as well. I'm just going to replace the alternator bracket which goes on the top of the head, and then we'll bolt the alternator back to it, and then there's the heat shield that goes beyond that. We'll bolt that back into place as well. One bolt goes into this this bracket and one bolt's underneath. So once that's back on, the alternator's back in place, and then we can move on to the cam belt. We're now going to start putting the cam belt back together, so let's replace the cover that goes behind the cam wheels. Once that's in place, we'll just bolt that back into place. It's fairly simple. Just replace the bolts that we took out earlier, and then we can put the cam wheels back on. I fitted the new Cambelt tensioner, which is fairly simple. It's obviously one bolt down the centre to take your old one off, put your new one back the same, put your two cam wheels back in, make sure exhaust for the exhaust side, inlet for the inlet side pointing together, put your camshaft locking tool back in, and the centre nuts want torquing down 65 Newton meters. Okay, now they're done, we can start putting the cam belt on. That's the two centre nuts on the cam wheels to tighten down to 65 Newton meters. We can now fit the cam belt. So if you just feed it around the engine mount. Just remember to do it on the tension side first, so it's the opposite side where the idler and the tension of the water pump are. So you want to put the cam belt around the crank, fit it onto the exhaust cam gear first, then onto the inlet one, and then round the water pump and then the tensioner. And then I'll show you how to tension it in just a second. To tension the belt up, this is the tensioner. Obviously you can't see it down there, so I'm just going to show you with the old one. Just a 6mm Allen key in the adjuster, and you just wind it round. There's a as you will see, there's a bolt there that hangs onto the tensioner spring, and then what you turn it round until that little pointer will move round and point in the middle of that pointer, and that's the tension it wants to be at. And then as you're holding it there with a 6mm Allen key, you then tighten the centre bolt down. It's just an M8 bolt, it just wants to be like 25 Newton meters. With the belt tensioned up, we can remove the locking tool from the cams. We can then replace the bottom pulley bolt. Just don't put the pulleys on or anything, put the bolt in, then we need to turn the engine 2 revolutions. Just do it by hand with a socket, 22mm socket on the end of the bolt there. Turn it round and then recheck your timing marks. Make sure that the one on the crankshaft, the two little dots and the pointer are in line, and our inlet and exhaust marks on our cam wheels are in line. And once they're in line, we can then replace the covers. So I've turned the crank by 2 full revolutions, recheck the timer marks on the crankshaft and the ones on the cam pulleys, they're all okay. Now you just want to recheck your pointer on your tensioner, and if it has slipped back, so the little aluminium pointer is not with a spring, just with your 6mm Allen key again, just slacken off the centre bolt, 6mm Allen key in there, just put a little bit more tension on it, then re-torque up your centre bolt. We're now going to replace the Cambelt covers, top cover and the lower cover. Once they're both in place, we can put on the bottom crank pulley. That will want torquing down to 205 Newton meters. It may well at this time be possible just to put it into gear, get somebody to put the foot on the brake, and then you'll be able to hold the crank so you can torque it down to 205 Newton meters. And then we can replace the drive belts. I'm now going to fit the inner wheel arch cover back on. We just need to feed our 2 plugs, the ABS plug and the pad warning wire plug, back through the holes so we can reconnect them to the plugs on the inner wing, and then they sit into these 2 little clips here. So that's it, just replace it, reverse of what we took it out, put our little clips in, and then that'll be done. I'm now going to replace the engine mount on the front. So if you just pop it onto the one stud on the inner wing, you might just have to grab the engine and just wiggle it about so you can get the bolt started. Make sure you get all 3 of them hand started before you start doing it with a socket and bar, just to make sure that they are not cross threaded. Then once those 3 are in, the nuts tightened up, then there's just a top bracket, fairly simple. 1 bolt through the centre, and then the 2 bolts in the side, then they just tighten everything up. That's the engine bracket all back on, everything tightened up now. So just replace this cooling hose to the back of the head. It's got one of them little spring clips and not a Jubilee clip, so just a pair of pliers, just get that into place, and then we're ready to move to the other end now and start doing some intake pipes and the radiator hoses. We're just going to replace the 2 cooling hoses down here now. There's obviously the top hose, and there's a little bypass hose at the back there. These do use these little spring clips, so just make sure that when they are back in place that the spring clip actually goes into the little groove on the aluminium casting so that they are nice and secure. It's fairly obviously a reversal of what we took to bits earlier now, so it's just a case of clipping in the cam sensor wiring and plugging it in, putting on the inlet pipe from the air filter, just setting up ready the wires that feed the coils, and then we're going to put on the cam covers. Now I'm going to replace the cam cover. So the Rover made it nice and easy here. Look, they've written top and exhaust side. So put it to the top, put that to the exhaust side, then replace the cam cover, then we'll bolt it all back up and put the plugs in. That's the rocker box all on now, so just going to replace these couple of breather pipes, one on there, the small little pipe down to the fuel pressure sensor down here. Get your pliers and just pop that clip onto there. Now I'm going to put the spark plugs in, replace the coil packs and put in the camshaft sensor. Now I'm just going to replace the cam sensor, so just pop it back in there, just the one bolt that holds that in. Tighten that up in a second. Here's your two coil packs. One goes in the centre, it does the centre two plugs, and the other one is in that end, and then feed the lead round to number 4 plug, and then there's just your 4 bolts, 2 in each coil pack, and then just replace the 2 wires. Just a couple of more pipes up here then, one from the inlet manifold to the cam box, same again, little spring clip onto there, and there's one at the back of the head from the vacuum control unit, just goes into the back of the inlet manifold. You'll see where that is, just a little hole that just pushes in there nicely. Then we can put the cover on the coil pack. Then there's a couple of jobs we need to do underneath. While we're underneath the car, I'm going to change the oil filter, so just spin it off, make sure you catch the oil, put a film of oil on the new filter and just refit it. That's nice and simple. There's the 2 bolts that go in the turbo oil return pipe into the block. Put those back on and tighten that up, and then we're going to fit the exhaust. We've cleaned the surface of the turbo earlier. We're going to clean the surface of the front pipe, clean both the surfaces on the front pipe, replace the gasket and bolt it back into place. Fairly simple. I'm going to show you that in a second. So I'm going to fit the front pipe now. We just need to just feed up the lambda sensor wire so that we can connect that up in a short while. It's a little bit, because this is a turbo version, just a little bit tight to get onto the front there. So then that's all in place. Now we'll get our new nuts and bolts, put either the new gasket in or a cleaned up old one into place. Then it's fairly simple. 3 nuts and bolts in the flange there, tighten those up. Your 3 studs at the top, tighten those up. Connect your lambda sensor up the top, and put the bracket around the exhaust, of course. And then that's it. We're on the home straight now. We're going to top it up, 4.5 litres of oil. We're going to top up the coolant, replace the air filter, and then we'll bleed the cooling system. Can be a bit awkward on these vehicles, but we'll show you that as and when we're doing it. We have the oil and water in now, and we're going to start the engine and bleed the cooling system. These are just very difficult to bleed the cooling system. There's a lot of pipes and it's a complicated plumbing system on these, but you need to just turn the heater on to hot, turn the fan on to just number 1, and you just have to just keep running it, keep revving it, just keep, hopefully they will bleed themselves, because they have got bleed pipes on them. There is one pipe, a metal pipe, that goes underneath the air intake pipe with a 10mm spanner sized nut on it. You can take that out and to just release some of the air in the cooling system, because that is the bleed system, but that's the only bleed point on this car. You just have to keep going round and just keep making sure the heater gets hot, and then the cooling system eventually will settle itself down. You may even well have to turn it off, let it cool down, let the water settle again, and then redo the job again. But it is just a case of working around it till everything's nice and warm, the heater's hot, the cooling fan cuts in and out, and then you'll know you're done. That's us all done. We've had the car running, we've bled the cooling system up, so I'm going to replace the header tank cap. I'm going to put on the right hand front wheel, let it down, take it for a drive, and then we're all okay.